episode 13 of Absolute History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic history, and a global medieval past. We're sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org. I'm your host, Talha Asana, first year PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Now onto the show. Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam, attributes itself to Ismail, who died in 762 Common Era, the eldest son of the sixth Shia Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. Ismailism rose at one point to become the largest branch of Shiism, climaxing as a political power with the Fatimid caliphate in the 10th through 12th century. To discuss with me today an introduction to the history of Ismailism is Dr. Khalil Andani. Dr. Andani completed his PhD at Harvard before his current role as Assistant Professor of Religion at Augustana College. Welcome, Dr. Andani.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
Let's start at the beginning to distinguish Ismailism from Twelver Shiism and Sunnism. Twelver Shias believe the legitimate successor to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq is his younger son, Musa al-Kadhim. Sketch for us the reason for this split and the subsequent development in their different understandings of revelation and the Prophet's spiritual and temporal legacy. And perhaps you can address why Ismailis are called Batiniya or esoteric, and what is the relationship between Ismailism and Sufism?
All right. Well, thank you for the question. Firstly, let me just point out there's a bit of an irony that the Abbasid History podcast has invited input about the Ismailis and the Fatimids. It's certainly something that your Abbasid patrons in the 10th century wouldn't be happy about, but I'm happy to be here. So, firstly, this term, I just want to begin by saying that the term Ismailism, it's not a native term used by this group. So this term, the actual term Ismailism, is a very modern idea, a modern concept from 20th century scholarship. And what we do find, though, in medieval heresiographical literature and what they call like the Firaq literature going back to the early 900s is you had actually what you could call proto-Twelver writers talking about the schism after the death of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, and they provide what you could call a sectarian account of the origins of Ismailism. So they of course don't use the term Ismailism, but they talk about the Ismailiya. And this version of events, of course, it presupposes the idea that you had a distinct Imami Shia community. And I think there's some research by people like Dr. Najm Hayder that indicates that by the early 2nd century, there was an Imami Shi'i community with a distinct identity, communal identity, ritual identity. So these Imami Shi'is, generally speaking, by the time of Ja'far as-Sadiq, they believed that the legitimate, divinely inspired, divinely guided successors to the Prophet Muhammad were a line of imams descended from Hussein, right? And Ali was the first of these imams, but the Imami Shia traced this imamate through select descendants of al-Hussein, and they believed that every imam was actually appointed by God, and every particular imam before he passed away had designated one of his sons to be the next imam. This, of course, is not very different from certain Umayyad ideas about the caliphate. You know, it's been suggested the early Umayyads saw themselves as divinely appointed leaders in somewhat similar way. But this was the Imami Shi'i belief. And of course, there's a variation in how people thought about the imams. There are ideas about the imams, the Husseinid imams, being divinely inspired in a way somewhat similar to the Prophet. There are ideas about the imams being in possession of esoteric and occult sciences. So, and there was a spectrum of views. But according to the sectarian narrative of this origins of this Ismaili 12 or schism, the Imam Jafar Sadiq had, by many indications, appointed his by some accounts, his second eldest son, Ismail, as his successor to the imamate. But by most accounts, Ismail passed away several years before Jafar Sadiq himself. And according to the heresiographical account provided by these proto-Imami scholars of the early 900s, one group of Imam Jafar's followers actually left him when Ismail died. And when Jafar Sadiq himself died, several sons claimed his succession. Most followed Abdullah, his eldest son. Some followed Musa Kazim. Some groups continued to believe that Ismail was the Imam after Jafar Sadiq, either believing Ismail was alive or that Ismail's son, Muhammad bin Ismail, was the rightful successor. So it looks like a bit of a mess early on. And again, this is just a sectarian account. So according to the sectarian account, the whole thing was about the imamate, who is the imam, what's the correct line of imams. And what happens is, this of course happened in the mid 700s, but by the mid 800s, there is an organized Ismaili Dawa operating, in many parts of Abbasid territory and doing quite well. And this is significant because when we look into the sources we have about this Ismaili Dawa, they don't call themselves Ismailis. They call themselves the Dawat al-Haq, or the Dawat al-Hadiya, the rightly guided summons. And of course, they believe in an imamate. They are calling people towards obedience and recognition of an imam descended from Ismail. But this Ismaili Dawa, again, using the term Ismaili for them is a bit anachronistic. They just see themselves as the possessors of the true meaning of Muhammad's revelation. And they offered a very intricate theology, hermeneutics, metaphysics, and so on. And again, this is in the 800s. So we're talking about the fact that there is an organized and distinct Ismaili intellectual and communal movement before the consolidation of Sunnism, before the consolidation of 12 or Shiism. And what happens, to be brief, is that this Ismaili Dawa, which again sees itself as an institution possessing salvific truth for Muslims, their efforts lead to the creation of the Fatimid caliphate. And that's in 909. And at that point, the Imam of the Ismailis, known as Abdullah al-Mahdi, he openly declares his imamate, both to the community of Ismailis as well as to the Muslim dominion at large. And him and his descendants function both as Ismaili imams and as Fatimid caliphs. And following by the late 11th century, there is a schism. This is an internal schism within the Ismaili Dawa, because the Ismaili Dawa continues while the Fatimid caliphs are still there. And you have a schism into what you call the Mustali and the Nizari Ismaili groups. And we can talk about the details of those schisms later. But what happens through all this is that the Ismailis develop a distinct approach to all the key theological topics debated by other Muslims. So there's an Ismaili concept of Tawheed, which is an apophatic theology. So it's a negative theology. They believe God is above all names and attributes. They have a Neoplatonic worldview. So like God creates a spiritual light called the intellect. The intellect emanates other celestial beings. Eventually you have the creation of the universe. So that's very distinct. And most Ismailis believe in this. And they see the role of the imam in relation to this cosmology. So the imam on earth is like a human reflection of the first created divine intellect. The imam is understood to be the possessor of the spiritual hermeneutics of the Quran and the cosmos. And in a practical sense, the Imam in Ismaili thought plays the role of an intercessor between God and the believers. So it's very common for Ismailis to supplicate the Imam, similar to how Twelvers will supplicate their Imams. But what one distinguishing factor is, at least in the Nizari branch of Ismailis, it is believed that there has been a present Imam on earth, like through all periods of history. So the Nizari Ismailis today recognize His Highness Aga Khan IV as their 49th 49th hereditary Imam, who plays the role of Imam for this community. The other Ismaili branches, which again we can go into details later, but they're known as the Boras, and they don't have an imam who is visible on earth. They believe they're imams, but they're hidden imams, and therefore the leadership of the Boras is held by you could say, a clerical figure known as the Dai Mutlaq. So in some, the Ismailis, they certainly follow a different line of imams from the Twelvers, right? So the leadership idea is certainly core, but I would emphasize that what makes Ismailis even more distinct from Twelvers and Sunnis is that there's an entire theology, hermeneutics, and way of approaching revelation that drastically differs. Your question mentioned the notion of the batin, the batiniya. So this became a pejorative term used for the Ismailis. They believe that there is a batin, a hidden meaning to revelation. So yes, the Ismailis do believe that, but they do believe, of course, that there's always a balance between the outward and the inward. Now, what the balance looks like depends on what the imam of a time guides them to do. But they believe in a balance. And in this sense, there is similarity we find between certain forms of Sufism, the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, the Sufism of Rumi, the Sufism of Hallaj to a certain extent. There's similarities between Sufi approaches and Ismaili approaches. Both groups believe in the batin behind the zahir. Both groups believe in wilaya. The Ismailis, of course, would restrict wilaya to the line of imams. The Sufis see it in a much wider sense. And there is a common Neoplatonic metaphysics between at least the Ibn Arabi school of Sufism, if you want to call that Sufism, and what the Ismailis have produced over the centuries.
In the year 930 Common Era, a group known as the Qaramatians, or in Arabic, the Qaramita, stole the black stone from the Kaaba in Mecca. They are often thought of being a manifestation of Ismailism. To what extent is this true?
So it's an interesting question. Again, it goes back to how we use the term Ismailism. If Ismailism is really an umbrella term, like it could be applied to any group that believes in the legitimate succession of Ismail and Ismail's descendants to the imamate. However, because it's an umbrella term, what we have in the 900s is the existence of rival Ismaili groups. So the group that followed the Fatimid empire, that recognized the Fatimid caliphs as their imams, that's the majority Ismaili group. But there were Ismaili groups that, when the first Fatimid caliph, Imam al-Mahdi, declared himself openly, there are some Ismaili groups who said he's not the imam, and they were awaiting the return of Muhammad, the son of Ismail, as a hidden imam. The Karamita are among that sevener group. So they didn't believe in the Fatimid Caliph imams as legitimate imams. And what happened is that by the 930s, you had a Karamati state in Bahrain. And this state was actually, they were quite a menace to the Abbasids. They were a menace to basically Muslims throughout the surrounding area. And they would actually pillage the Hajj pilgrims, people who are going to Mecca. And in the year 930, they stole the black stone, but they were not allied with the Fatimids at all. The Fatimids themselves detested the Karamitha, and in the next generations, what happens is in 939, the leader of the Qaramita of Bahrain, he reaches an agreement with the Abbasids, and the Abbasids are going to pay them tribute. So that's what happened. And in the next generations, the Qaramita of Bahrain will go to war against the Fatimids, and they'll lose pretty badly, and eventually they'll have to sort of accept the Fatimids as their overlords, reluctantly. So theologically speaking, the Karamita and the Fatimid Ismailis are two different groups, and there are many differences between them.
The high point for Ismailism comes with the Fatimid Empire. Time doesn't permit the fuller exposition required. Trace for us an outline of the rise and fall of this remarkable dynasty with sources for further reading and research.
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of the Fatimids is basically set up by a very powerful, maybe not powerful, very vibrant Dawa movement in the 800s, the mid to late 800s, that is finding success in Bahrain, in Syria, in Yemen, and in North Africa. So, because the Ismaili Dawa has basically set up different cells, and each cell, each subgroup is led by a Dai, right, a caller or a missionary. And the central leadership of the Ismaili Dawa is in Salamia, and these central leaders are actually a hereditary family, and they are the imams of the whole Ismaili Dawa. So what happens is that there's one particular Dai named Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i, and he successfully converts a number of the Kutama Berbers in North Africa to the Ismaili cause. Again, I'm using this term Ismaili provisionally. They didn't call themselves Ismaili, but we'll just use it. So the Dawa is very successful in North Africa, and this Dai establishes a state, and they take down the Aghlabids, who are sort of like this satellite dynasty for the Abbasids. So they take down the Aghlabids, and while this is going on, the future Fatimid Caliph, the leader of the Ismaili Dawa, Abdullah al-Mahdi, he journeys from Salamia to North Africa to meet this Dai. And the whole thing comes together in 909. Abdullah al-Mahdi is declared as the first caliph, and these caliphs at the very outset declare themselves as the descendants of Fatima, right, as the descendants of the Prophet's Ahlul Bayt. So they make this claim very early, and there are further developments from there. I'm not going to go into all the political details, but the after some difficulty, including some Berber revolts, the Fatimid Dawla, because now it's not just a Dawa, but it's a Dawla, it's a polity. It expands, and it expands into Egypt during the time of the fourth Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Muiz, and it continues to expand. It expands into the Hijaz, and there's recognition by the sharifs and the sayyids of Egypt, of Hijaz, and of other places, that these Fatimid caliphs are the Ahlul Bayt of the Prophet. Even one of the Buyid amirs recognizes this. So they're making inroads, and during the time of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi Amr Allah, who is unfairly maligned in a lot of historical accounts, especially by pro-Abbasid writers. But during his time, like the Fatimid Caliphate reaches a peak in the early thousands, right? So early 11th century, the Fatimids get recognized by certain tribal chiefs who are very close to Baghdad. So the Abbasids are very alarmed. And the Abbasids engage in like anti-Fatimid propaganda in the early 11th century. This is when you could say Sunnism as like a movement becomes consolidated, right, by the Abbasid Caliph al-Qadir and his successors. And so what we see generally is while the Fatimids are doing these political like successes, the Ismaili Dais are also in Abbasid territory, calling people to the recognition of the Imam, the Fatimid Caliph Imam. And the Fatimids are interesting because they don't present themselves as the Imams of just the Ismailis. They present themselves as God's caliphs, divinely appointed caliphs of everybody and everyone. And they rule in a pluralistic way. For the most part, they are not persecuting the Sunni ulama for the most part. There's some occasions they do, but for the most part, they're not doing this. They're appointing like Maliki judges alongside like Ismaili Qadis, for example. And they're ruling over Sunni majority. So they take for what at that time a pluralistic approach to governance. But the 11th century, that was the peak of Fatimid rule. In 1058, for example, the Buyid general working on behalf of the Fatimids even took Baghdad for a whole year. And Baghdad, the name of the Fatimid Caliph Imam, was proclaimed in the khutbah from the mosques. So that's the peak. And then the downfall begins from there. The downfall has many reasons behind it. The Fatimid court is full of power players. It becomes a chaotic mess in the Fatimid court. Eventually, the viziers and the military generals, they collect all the power in the Fatimid court. The Fatimid Caliph becomes rather powerless, politically speaking, even though he's still the head of the Dawah. And there seems to be some sort of recognition that they've lost control of the state, and more attention is given to the Dawah, it's been suggested, by the Imams during this decline. And all of this leads to the lessening of Fatimid territory. So by 1094, when the Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Mustansir passes away, the Caliph is no longer in charge of the Fatimid state. It's been taken over by the Vizier Badr al-Jamali and Badr al-Jamali's son, who becomes the next Vizier. And when this Fatimid Caliph Imam Mustansir Bilad dies, his appointed successor, by most accounts, who is Nizar, Nizar is not allowed to take the Fatimid throne as caliph. The vizier al-Afdal al-Jamali places a younger son of Mustansir, known as Mustayali. They place him on the throne. So that's your schism between the Nizari Ismailis and the Mustayli Ismailis. And luckily, the Nizari leadership, or the future leader of the Nizari movement, Hassan-i-Sabah, he had already been banished from Cairo for falling into conflict with these military generals, and he already established an independent set of fortress states in Iran. So what happens is Nizar's descendants, the imams of the Nizaris, they are able to flee from Egypt through North Africa to Persia, where they find this safe refuge, Nizari polity, waiting for them. So the Nizari imama continues in Iran. The Fatimid Caliphate continues. There's another schism that happens, and eventually Saladin puts an end to the whole thing in the 1200s.
Every human trend apparently over time tends to split into further branches. You've alluded to this earlier. Trace for us the various branches of Ismailism around the world following the fall of the Fatimids, with recommendations for further reading.
Okay, sure. So one thing I would say, just for the Fatimids, Paul Walker has a great book called Exploring an Islamic Empire that gives you the lay of the land of Fatimid studies. And another scholar, Shainul Jiwa, she's a scholar at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. She's translated Fatimid texts, and she's written a lot about the Fatimids as well. Heinz Halm's book on the Fatimids, The Empire of the Mahdi, that's sort of like a classic title on the dynasty. Farhad Daftari's History of the Ismailis also goes into the Fatimids. That's just some examples. Now, as for schisms, there's one schism that happens during the Fatimid era where a group of Dais revere the Imam Khalif al-Hakim as the manifestation of God. And they believe that al-Hakim is like the last Imam, that the Imama has ended with al-Hakim, and that through al-Hakim, all the esoteric truths have been finally consummated and unveiled. So this movement of these Dais who revere al-Hakim in this way, they become known as the Druze. And the Druze eventually splits out to become like its own faith, its own tradition. I don't think they consider themselves as Ismailis, or they don't call themselves Ismailis. So that's one schism that happens. And it goes to show that while the Fatimids are, a dynasty with a dawla, the dawa, the Ismaili dawa, continues to exist during the whole rule of the dynasty, and the dawa continues to exist after the fall of the Fatimids, which is not the case with the Abbasids, right? The Abbasids dismantled their dawa like as soon as they came into power. The Fatimids didn't do that. And what this also means is that doctrinal issues were a priority. So there are many Ismaili Dais in the Fatimid lands and in non-Fatimid lands, and they're engaging among themselves in a respectful dialogue and dialectical engagement about theology. So they're talking about the nature of God. What is the nature of the Imam? What is the concept of Sharia that the Prophet brings? Can the Sharia be abrogated? What is the nature of Ta'wil? So this is all going on at the same time, and sometimes, not sometimes, but doctrine and theology lies behind a lot of the schisms. The example I'll give you is when the Fatimid Caliph Imam Mustansir Billah passes away, both groups on both sides of the schism agreed that he had designated Nizar as his successor to the imamate. And the group that followed Musta'ali, they had to give theological arguments as to why the designation of the successor could be changed, for example. So that's a theological question. And that question goes all the way back to the Ismaili Twelver schism, where even the Twelvers, later Twelvers will deny this, but the early proto-Twelvers admitted that Ismail was the original designated successor, and they resorted to a concept of bada, or sort of new information manifesting to God. That's what the texts actually say, that something new manifested to God, and therefore God then changed, the designation from Ismail to Musa al-Kazim. It's like some early 12er said this. So there's a theology at work behind these schisms. So you have this Nizari versus Musta'ali schism in 1094, 1095. So that's one schism. If you look at the Musta'ali side of things, the next two imams that they believe in, Musta'ali himself and al-Amir, they are also caliphs of the empire. But while they're caliphs, the vizier has basically taken over the power. And when al-Amir died, right, al-Amir, he's the 20th imam of the Musta'alis. When he died, it was not clear who his successor was. So the group known as the Tayyibis, they said that al-Amir left an infant son to be the next imam, and that this son was very quickly spirited away by the highest ranking Dais into a concealment. So this group that recognizes al-Amir's son, whose name is Tayyib, they become known as the Tayyibis, and they say the whole line of imams is now in concealment. They're alive and they're succeeding each other, father and son, but they're in concealment. So the leader of this group, who's actually this queen in Yemen, Arwa al-Suhaili, or the Suhaili dynasty, she appoints a chief Dai as the representative of this hidden line of imams. So the Tayyibis instead of following manifest imams, they follow chief dais as the leader. And they themselves go into schisms. So today, I won't go to the details, but today there are 3 Tayyibi Ismaili groups. They're all, they're known as Boras today, which is an Indic term. There's the Sulaimani group, mostly in Yemen. The Dawoodi Boras, who are the most popular group, they are in India. And then the Alavid or Alawi Boras, also in India. So these are 3 Tayyibi groups. They all believe in the same line of imams, but they believe in different dais. So that's one side. And then if you go to the other side, you have the Nizari Ismailis, who followed Nizar's descendants. And for about I think for 70 years, Nizar's descendants, the imams of this group, did not publicly appear for about 70 years. There's indications that they were present and that they're doing stuff behind the scenes. They're communicating through dais, but they don't publicly show themselves. And then in 1164, the Nizari imam does publicly appear. And his name is Hassan al-Zikri Salam. And this imam, for the Nizari community, makes many changes in the theology and the practice of the Nizaris. So with him, and this had been expected even centuries, like a couple centuries earlier, but it was expected that there would come an imam who would unveil the spiritual meaning of the Sharia practices, like praying 5 times a day and fasting in Ramadan. And in revealing that spiritual meaning, this expected imam would abrogate some of the Sharia ritual practice. And this is what the 23rd Nizari imam did. And this event was called the Qiyamah. Again, it's not the literal end of the world. It's like a spiritual unveiling. So this is a major evolution in Nizari Ismaili thought. And there is this belief that although this Qiyamah lasted about 50 years, so 50 years later, after that declaration, the Nizaris start practicing the Sharia again. It seems to be because they want to avoid being persecuted by Sunnis. But this idea of Qiyamah, that the Imam at any time can unveil the inner meaning of Sharia practice and therefore transform the ritual practice of the Nizari community based on his divinely inspired will, that idea prevails in Nizari Ismaili tradition. So today, under the leadership of the Aga Khan, who's the 49th Imam of the Nizari Ismailis, if you look, the Nizari practice of Islam is not really a Sharia practice of Islam. So the Nizaris have prayers, they have purification rituals, they have fasting practices, they have all these things, but the forms of these rituals is different from the way, from the fiqh practice of Sunni madhahib and 12er Shia. And that part, the reason behind that is because the Nizaris believe that the Imam has the authority to transform and adjust religious practices based on changing times and circumstances, and based on this notion that all religious practice exists for the sake of spiritual realization. So sometimes you need a more spiritually transparent form of practice, and sometimes you need a more legalistic form of practice, and it's the imam who sort of decides. And this contrasts even to the Boras. So the Boras still practice a fiqh form of Islam that is based on Fatimid fiqh, whereas the Nizari Ismaili practice has been much more flexible. You don't really have a Nizari Ismaili fiqh in the classical sense.
As we come to an end, tell us about your current and forthcoming work. You are active on social media and you share your lessons on YouTube.
Yes, so I have a YouTube channel. It's in my name. There's a ton of lectures there that I talk about all sorts of topics from an academic perspective, including theological topics like the existence of God or tawassul, intercessory prayer. So you can check those out, those who are interested. the topic I'm currently working on right now, among many other things, like many of you, including you, Talha, I have too much on my plate. But I'm working on the topic of revelation. I'm looking at a chronology of the evolution of different Muslim theories of the revelation of the Quran and what the Quran is, the Quran's relationship to divine speech, how that affects hermeneutics. So I'm looking at Quranic, various Sunni exegetical and theological traditions, Imami Shiism, Ismaili thought. I'm looking at all the traditions and how their views of Quranic revelation have evolved. So that's the focus of my book, my first book. Maybe it'll spill into 2 books, I don't know. But that's what I'm working on, and that's what I had conversations about on sort of other podcasts. But I'm really grateful for you having me here. And again, I hope your Abbasid patrons don't persecute you for inviting a voice about the Ismailis and the Fatimids.
Dr. Andani, thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
That's a cut.